prison cell and dungeon vile, when friends by shame are undefiled, how can I keep from singing? Sometimes you plan a sermon a couple of months in advance, and then life or the news or the events of the world intercede and ask you to change things. In this case, a little bit of both, I think. So in the TED Talk that we saw this morning, Brian Stevenson, the civil rights attorney and criminal justice attorney in Alabama, is describing this disparity in how justice is often carried out in the United States, and he doesn't name it as such, but he's referring to a dynamic that many people call the new Jim Crow. Has anyone heard that phrase? Yeah, a couple? Okay, good. So, this phrase, the new Jim Crow, is used to describe legal methods in the United States that are officially colorblind and yet produce the same effects as Jim Crow era America. This began mostly in the 1970s and 80s with the war on drugs. So he notes that in the 70s we had 300,000 people in jails and prisons in the United States, and now we have 2.3 million people in American jails. We have the highest concentration of people behind bars in human history in this country, more than Stalin ever put in jail, more than Iran or China or any country that we like to associate with justice that doesn't look like what we believe it should. These laws, the war on drugs, are the primary motivator behind why so many people are in prison, and most of those people who are going to jail on that are for simple possession charges. And what we now know from those years, because documents have been leaked, is that the people who created many of those laws did so explicitly with race in mind. That political firms were hired, that marketing executives were hired to come up with the notions of a crack baby, that drug use was on decline the preceding years before the war on drugs was officially launched, and that these laws disproportionately affect people of color. The possession for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine is 100 times to 1 in terms of prosecution amount that you have to have. And that drug use and drug selling among people of color and white Americans is the same, and yet people of color are locked up at degrees that are unimaginable. What happens, as he described in the talk, when these laws that disproportionately affect people of color in the United States, is that soon, in the coming years, we may have a situation in this country in which as many black people cannot vote today as before the Voting Rights Act was signed. All in the name of a system that is officially colorblind. And at the end of his talk, he says, something stunning is that in the midst of this very real crisis, there is a stunning silence. He says we are comfortable with it because it's the language of crime and punishment mostly, but also most of us can walk through our daily life believing it's not my problem. When I heard him talk about not my problem, the first thing I thought of was the story in the Bible, just a few pages in my copy, where after Cain and Abel, the third and fourth humans, at least as that poetic description describes them, have been engaged in violent behavior. Cain has killed his brother Abel. The God Yahweh comes looking for him and says, "Cain, where's your brother?" And his response is, "Am I my brother's keeper?" I believe that this question, this spiritual question, am I my brother and sister's keeper, is perhaps one of the most foundational questions of what Unitarian Universalism strives to be. Am I my brother and sister's keeper? Do we belong to one another? Are we cousins? Is the suffering of others my problem? So you and I in this congregation in the city of Dallas will get a chance to answer that question in tangible ways in the weeks coming. We will get to see what it looks like for a city to decide, are we our brother and sister's keepers? As thousands of children, thousands of them, flee violence and poverty in Central America and make their way across the border to the United States. Am I my brother and sister's keeper? Is this my problem? Do we belong to one another? I have to tell you, I've been astounded by the response of members of this congregation. One news story hits, and dozens of phone calls and emails coming in from this congregation saying, "What can we do? We've got to do something right now." And I can't get an answer back to people fast enough. In the past 2 weeks, members of our congregation, as well as other religious leaders in town and elected politicians, have been meeting in meetings across the city, and they've been catching us up on what the reality of the situation is. The reality is that in countries like Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras, children are fleeing situations that are so terrible through violence in warring drug cartels and street gangs, often dueling over the same drug war problems that we have created here in our country, leave, and their parents are willing to send them with a piece of paper strapped to their chest with their name on it, traveling thousands of miles, often at the hands of human smugglers who maybe weeks before were putting people into modern-day slavery, until they take a thousands-of-mile journey. Mostly, we're talking children. They're mostly men, but becoming more and more young women. And on that journey, they are facing the difficulties and the violence and the fear that you might imagine young women would face on such a journey. And then they arrive here, thousands of miles away from their parents, some of them in diapers. And how will they be met? I'm sure many of you saw images from that town in California whose response was to gather at the roadways where the buses were bringing these children in and to extend their hands and grab each other so that the buses couldn't make it into their town, with angry faces and signs that said, "Go home." Now, first of all, it's not illegal for these children to come here. You can seek political refugee status in the United States if you're coming from violence and war. This isn't a question of whether they will be deported or not. The president has made that clear. This is a question of how humans will receive suffering children before any of this process happens. I found myself watching those images on the news and wondering if 60,000 young white children suffering violence were moving across a country's border, if the news story would look different. I found myself wondering, in response to Brian Stevenson's talk, if a third of all the young white men in America were being locked behind bars and their right to vote being taken away disproportionately, if this would be our problem. Are we all in this together? Do we belong to one another? Am I my brother and sister's keeper? I wouldn't ask this question if the answer wasn't yes. Our Universalist heritage, in fact, affirms without a doubt, clear as day, was, is, and will be forever, yes. Our Universalists were the side of our history that said no loving God will ever condemn any part of its creation to hell. They were primarily rural people who had big tent revivals in which they would say, "Guess what? God loves you and there's nothing you can do about it." Hosea Ballou, one of the most famous Universalist preachers at the time, this is early 1800s, was getting widely known for preaching this universal love of God, no exceptions kind of business. And one day after one of the services, this man approached him and said, "Reverend Ballou, I have a problem. My son, you won't believe it, he goes out, he's drinking every night, he comes home, he's drunk, he's associating with a bad crowd." Nothing changes, right? He said, "My son is going out getting drunk every night and he's drinking. I'm worried that he will go to hell. I'm worried about the state of his soul." And Hosea Ballou says, "Great, I've got a solution. What time does he come home?" The man says, "Well, he usually comes home really late, about 2 or 3. And Hosea Ballou says, "Perfect, let's build a fire and wait for him to come home." The man and the Universalist minister sit tending a fire, and suddenly at 2 or 3 in the morning they see the young man stumbling drunk back to his home, and the man says, "There, that's my son." Hosea Ballou looks at him and says, "Great, now here's what you got to do. When he comes over here, throw him in the fire. And the man looks at him and says, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. I'm not going to throw my child into the fire. Hosea Ballou looks at him and says, well, don't worry, neither will God. The central question around the love that we're meant to express, Hosea Ballou framed in terms of a parent and child. God's love for creation was like a parent to a child. The central question he had to ask is, could you do that to your child? For the Universalists, then, their understanding of what justice meant shifted from retribution as justice to compassion as justice. They said, we are not meant to order human society based on punishment, but rather compassion. They understood laws and boundaries, but they said the primary motivating factor for us, first and foremost, always must be compassion, because that's how God works. Now, at the time this was controversial. Universalists were not allowed to be on juries in America for a short period of time because they thought if we didn't believe in eternal punishment, something was utterly wrong with our moral compass and we couldn't be trusted on a jury panel. Maybe they're still right. But for them, the entire role of religion shifted from a world in which I am an unworthy human seeking the affection and love of a perfect God. They said, that's all done. You can't even change that. You can't get away from God even if you wanted to, they said. For them, the point of religion was not getting people into heaven, but getting heaven into people. They decided, since we're all going to end up at the same place, our task is now to go about building heaven on earth. They were active in social justice movements in the United States because of that. Am I my brother and sister's keeper? Do we belong to one another? Is the suffering of others my problem? So we live in a predominantly Christian country, in a predominantly Christian city. You're not surprised by that. And so this week I went back to read what the founding teacher of that tradition has to say about treating immigrants and prisoners. I went back and I read the book of Matthew. In the beginning, it says that this teacher, Jesus, was at risk of violence in his home country, and so his parents took him across a border without documentation into Egypt. Literally. And then 33 years later, he is put to death unjustly. So you won't be surprised that this teacher, when he's sitting around talking to his students, in one of the most famous passages, says, one day, when the time of the judgment of who we are comes, I'm going to be sitting at the right hand of God, and I'm going to separate the sheep and the goats. For any of you who used to like the band Cake, the song Sheep Go to Heaven, Goats Go to Hell. And Jesus says, so here's the way we're going to do this. You're going to get to heaven, and I'm going to say, thank you. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was in prison and you visited me. I was naked and you gave me clothes. And the people say, but what are you talking about, Jesus? I never saw you. What do you mean? His response is, you know this. Whatever you've done to one of the least of these, you've done to me. Now, this is not actually the most universalist passage from Jesus in the text. He actually is talking about separating those who get to be with God from not. But let's forget that piece for just a minute. And focus instead on the fact that what he's claiming is the very fate of our souls. Our souls will be defined by whether we have welcomed the stranger, clothed the naked, and visited prisoners with compassion. The very state of our souls will be defined around how we answered the question, am I my brother and sister's keeper? I agree with him. Although I believe our collective soul is at stake in this question as well. I don't think any one of us gets to live in an unjust society or society without compassion and get away scot-free. It's like a garden when you tend it. No plant can escape bad soil in your plot. If all you're concerned about is yourself in this issue, you should know it still matters. California and Stanford University as well have done studies that show that if you cultivate compassion and mindfulness for the suffering of others, you will literally sleep better, be happier, more content, and your heart will literally function better. But think also the effects of cultivating a mindset of not in my backyard. Think of the pain that those people with their arms outstretched saying to scared children, get out of here. Think of the spiritual and emotional consequences it will have, the toll it will take on the very people who have said, go home. They won't escape without harm either. And in a society where we're locking up a third of all young black men, I know that parents of color in our congregation grow up with an anxiety about their children's well-being that I will never have to face for my white child. I don't have to worry that he is going to be convicted unjustly of crimes. I don't have to worry that he will be stopped when other people wouldn't. But I know that parents, even who aren't directly affected by these realities, will be. This is our problem. And I know that unjust systems affect the moral imagination of everybody involved, including the privileged. I'm thinking of my son growing up and whether he will learn to associate dark skin with criminality more so than white skin because of what he's seen in the media. I worry that a system that separates us as such will teach him to think of people differently, and I worry that he will be denied his God-given right to fully love his brothers and sisters because of what he's been taught. I worry that if he's old enough to start understanding the news and he hears people questioning whether or not we should treat scared children with compassion, he will grow up believing that's actually a question. Everybody is affected by such systems. The Universalist claim was that we're all going to the same place, and so we had better get on building the right place. Heaven or hell, we're all going there together. I am so profoundly proud and hopeful of what I have seen in our city in the last few weeks. With the dozens and dozens of calls and emails from our church members and sitting around tables last week with Baptists, Jews, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Unitarians, and politicians. And the only question we had is, how can we be the most compassionate city we can be for these children? That was the only question on the table. I was so profoundly proud. For our county judge, Clay Jenkins, to say in an interview, this is Texas, and in Texas, we don't turn our back on children. See, that's the Texas I grew up in. And this is a Unitarian Universalist church. And in a Unitarian Universalist church, the answer to do we belong to one another, is this my problem, am I my brother and sister's keeper, has been, is, and will be for the end of time, yes, yes, and yes. You are invited in this church to be a builder of heaven on earth. We believe that it is absolutely possible to build pockets of something that looks like heaven on earth, where we are just and loving. That if you do so, your life will be profoundly joy-filled and meaningful and deep, and others will be too. And you are invited. And yet, you must remember that anything that has value comes with a cost. If you decide to be a builder of heaven on earth, you will have to face realities of suffering that you don't want to look at. And if you want to be a builder of heaven on earth, you'll have to allow your heart to break open and expand big enough to hold the world's joy and pain. And if you want to be a builder of heaven on earth, then we have to admit out loud and hold ourselves accountable to the fact that our church is not a not in my backyard kind of religion. It's a we are all in this together kind of religion. You are invited to ask yourself in every conversation, in every classroom, in every dinner group, in every political meeting, when you're watching the TV or standing next to somebody in the train station who has a difference of opinion, you are invited to be a vocal presence for a belief, a fundamental belief that we are all in this together. Am I my brother's keeper? Are we cousins? Is this my problem? Do we belong to one another? Yes, and yes, and yes, forever and ever. Amen.